Welcome to the Still Curtain podcast. It is Sunday, March 9th, and the Pittsburgh Steelers have traded for DK Metcalf. I'm Josh Yourish with you here at about 8:25 Eastern Time on Sunday night. And we've got an emergency podcast because this is about as big a piece of news as the Steelers were going to give us heading into free agency this week. They make their big move. They make their big move on offense. It's not for a quarterback, but for a position of desperate need nonetheless, adding the star wide receiver for a second round pick. The Steelers and the Seahawks are also swapping sixth and seventh round picks in this year's draft. And the Steelers, and I think this is probably the most important part of this, agree to a 5-year, $150 million contract with Metcalf, making him one of the highest paid receivers in the NFL. And the Steelers have their guy. They waited all last offseason, didn't want to pay the price of a first for Brandon Ayuk, and in my opinion are getting a receiver of his ilk, if not slightly better and more proven at this point through his career at 27 years old with Metcalf. And what does this mean for the Steelers quarterback situation? What does this mean for George Pickens potentially getting a contract extension? What does this mean for the rest of the Steelers offense? It's hard to tell at this point, but if you're in the show, in the chat, make sure you drop questions, comments, anything. We want to know your thoughts, and I'm just going to try to get out my thoughts as I break this down and dig through what news we have here with this DK Metcalf trade. Metcalf, 6'4", 235-pound receiver. Just for some context, a former second-round pick. So retaining his value heading into a massive contract year. In 2024, played 15 games, caught 66 passes for 992 yards and 5 touchdowns. Not a fantastic season by his typical marks. 2023, 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns. 2022, over 1,000 yards again. And his best season came in 2020, his second season in the NFL. 83 catches for 1,300 yards and 10 touchdowns. Also had 12 touchdowns and nearly 1,000 yards in 2022. The Steelers need a red zone threat. They need everything in this passing game. They don't have a quarterback yet, but they at least have somebody that's going to be able to catch the ball. And that's massive news. George Pickens, in my opinion, if he was a more reliable individual, I'll say, I would trust him more as the number one wide receiver. Now, DK Metcalf is not going to get glowing remarks in that regard, but he is a proven veteran professional wide receiver who has proven it over a much longer stretch than Pickens has, with much lower rates of volatility and higher consistent effort. And I think he's a better receiver regardless of any of that. So the Steelers have their number one guy. And who does this point to in terms of the quarterback? Because a lot of those great seasons that I listed off with DK Metcalf, who was throwing him passes? Now, for the last couple in Seattle, it was Geno Smith, who was just traded to the Raiders, as we have movement all over the NFL. But before Geno, it was our boy Russell Wilson. Still unsigned heading into free agency, as is Justin Fields, as is Sam Darnold, as is Aaron Rodgers. And Jesse Peters in the chat says, get Rodgers. I don't entirely disagree. Of the veteran options that are available to the Steelers, because we have to talk about quarterback, this move, it just impacts what the Steelers are going, where they're going directionally, and it gives them a foundational offensive piece. And I love that regardless of if they have an answer at quarterback. But to me, this signals we think our defense, despite its performance against Baltimore in the first round of the playoffs, is championship caliber. We think our offense is fairly close. And to me, if that's the case, you do swing big with Aaron Rodgers. I think Aaron Rodgers is a more talented quarterback than Russell Wilson at this point in their respective careers. I think coming off of the Achilles, Aaron Rodgers was not fantastic last year in New York by any stretch of the imagination, but his arm is still there. He still showed some really nice moments. He had a humbling season, which would maybe have him coming to Pittsburgh a little more amenable to coaching from Mike Tomlin, somebody he's shared his affection for in the past, either on the field or in press conferences. Aaron Rodgers is probably the direction I would go with DK Metcalf. But if you go to Justin Fields and you draft a mid-rounder, as last week on my Monday show with Cody Williams, we went through all the top 10 quarterbacks in the 2025 draft. There are some guys out there that I'm intrigued by that I think could be a potential long-term answer for the Steelers in this draft. If you're going to go mid-tier bridge with Justin Fields, I think this makes Justin Fields potentially the best he's ever been and puts him in the best situation he's ever been in the NFL. His offensive lines were disastrous in Chicago. He didn't have receivers until they finally traded for DJ Moore. DK Metcalf to me is a better wide receiver than DJ Moore, a more complete wide receiver than DJ Moore. This is a guy who can win 50-50 balls down the sideline, but he's also a big physical guy over the middle of the field. Arthur Smith is going to love DK Metcalf because, I mean, he played with A.J. Brown at Ole Miss. He can do a lot of those similar things. He's not as good as A.J. Brown, but he can run those crossers over the middle of the field, and he can catch it, take a hit, run after the catch, and is just going to make everything so much easier for the Steelers having this number one option. It's going to make everything so much easier, and it would make everything so much easier for Justin Fields if he's the quarterback. It would be the best situation he's ever been in to potentially develop into something. I know that's getting old this far into his NFL career, but if it's going to happen, maybe it would happen with Pickens and with Metcalf. And if it is Russell Wilson, and I do not want it to be Russell Wilson, if it is Russell Wilson quarterbacking the Steelers next year, because I feel like that's the way to do this, right? Go through the quarterback options. I'd rather have Rodgers than anyone else. But after that, I'd want Fields. And then if we bring back Russell Wilson, who's probably the third option, I don't see the Steelers paying up for Sam Darnold. It looks like the Seahawks maybe want to do that. I don't see them going any other direction with a trade. They just used a large amount of draft capital to get Metcalf, which I think is just an excellent deal, being willing to pay him if you're in the mindset of winning now, which the Steelers are. So these comments have to be taken in the context of reality, which is always a good context to use, but the reality that the Steelers are not going to rebuild, right? In my opinion, my humble opinion, the Steelers should be doing what the Seahawks are doing. The Steelers should be looking to trade their good players, get draft capital, maybe get a young up-and-coming head coach like Mike McDonald, but that's not going to happen, and turn this thing over because it's an aging roster without an answer at quarterback. And with that, what are you going to do? Win 10 games like the Seahawks, like the Steelers did, and potentially the Seahawks were going to? That doesn't really get you anywhere. But within the bounds, the confines of reality, the Steelers are not going to rebuild. The Steelers are not going to tear this thing down to the studs the way maybe they should. So, in that context, a second-round pick for DK Metcalf, yes, it's for the right to pay him 5 years, $150 million, which is a contract that'll take him through his 32nd birthday. I feel good about that. I feel really good about that. The Steelers desperately needed something to construct an offense around. And I don't think George Pickens is that guy. I'd much rather it be DK Metcalf. I'll get to Pickens' future later. But in the context of these three quarterbacks, if it's Russell Wilson, again, I'd rather have Rodgers. I'd rather have Fields. If it's Russell Wilson coming back here, could you name two more perfect receivers to play with Russell Wilson than George Pickens and DK Metcalf? I'm not sure you could. These are massive targets on the outside that can win jump balls. That is how Russell Wilson has thrived at his best in the NFL. And it's been with different body types, right? It's been with Doug Baldwin or Tyler Lockett, but it's been scramble drill, it's been go ball. The scramble drill is now gone from Wilson's game because he's a limited athlete. The go ball is still there. And if the idea is Wilson's coming back, then this makes that much more palatable for me. Much, much more palatable for me. And I was bordering on, as I'm sure a lot of Steelers fans are wrestling with this feeling of apathy, of we're stuck in this perpetual 10-win season. And yes, that's great. And yes, a lot of fan bases would be thrilled to have that. But we're stuck in this NFL purgatory. How do we possibly get out? Well, I think moves like this, it's rejuvenated me to do an emergency podcast at 11 or not 11 at 8:30 on a Sunday night, and it will rejuvenate me going into this season regardless of who the quarterback is. I think this is an excellent move from Omar Khan. I think it's excellent value. I think it's smart to pay receivers as early as possible. This contract that the Steelers are paying DK Metcalf is huge. It's exorbitant money. If you just pay the guy early, they got this done before Jamar Chase got his deal. That's going to be a massive deal. The Eagles have done the best job of this in the NFL, paying their guys early because those contracts become a bargain quickly. But the Steelers are doing a great job with it, with this deal. And this comes in the wake of Davante Adams going back to the West Coast to the Rams. And I would rather have Adams for 2 years. I believe it's $48 million in total. So a big contract for Adams, but not nearly as big as 5 for $150 for Metcalf. And the deals are, and the details are going to continue to come out about this. We're going to learn about the structure of the contract more and more. But with Adams off the table, DK was the guy. And Omar Khan went and got him because the Steelers could not do another season with the receiving core that they trotted out a year ago. And the Steelers don't have Kevin Colbert nailing second and third round receivers and turning them into stars anymore. Deontay Johnson flamed out and was gone. George Pickens is on the verge of maybe doing the same. And the Steelers got a reliable veteran guy who's proven he can do it in the NFL, who got disgruntled in Seattle. But receivers get disgruntled. I'm not going to hold that against DK. And they got a franchise receiver, a number one receiver. I think that is great business. And to me, it sets up where the Steelers are potentially going to go at quarterback. And as Michael P. says, I think Rodgers will be a Steeler. I kind of think so too. If I don't know. There's so many flirtations. I think that's the right move for the Steelers to go and get Rodgers. I don't know that I think he will be a Steeler. I think the most likely outcome is a Russell Wilson reunion. And we don't know how DK Metcalf feels about Russell Wilson. And we don't know that his opinion will be factored into the decision-making whatsoever. But whoever is the quarterback, this makes the Steelers a more functional offense and a much better team. And that gets me excited about this season in a way that I didn't think I could be. And this is reactionary. This is in the moment. But I had said throughout this offseason, either the Steelers need to rebuild or they need to take a big swing on offense because being stuck in the middle is pointless. And if you are going cheap at quarterback, you better pay up for the rest of the offense. And they're doing that. So I have very little notes about this deal. It's hard to critique a second round pick. No second round pick, especially at wide receiver. We haven't broken down this wide receiver class. I think we probably still will on the Still Curtain podcast. So make sure you like and subscribe. But it's not a loaded wide receiver class this year. I think every receiver class, and Ben Solak, previously of The Ringer, now of ESPN, is somebody who made this point more eloquently than I will. I don't know that any wide receiver draft class is going to be bad anymore. And this is Solak's theory. because the proliferation of 7-on-7 football in youth development, the increase in passing games in youth development, and the increase in salaries at the wide receiver position funnels the great athletes that may have been running backs, that may have gone to other positions, to wide receiver. So we're never really going to have a bad wide receiver draft class again. I don't think this one's bad, but compared to the depth of last year's class and years past, it doesn't have the top end superstars, though I love Tedero and McMillan. And as Michael P says, I think it's weak this year. We're going to find out. And this is the type of wide receiver draft class that will test Solak's theory that there's never going to be a weak wide receiver draft class again. But the Steelers may not have to be the ones that find that out because they have DK Metcalf now. And that is just, 3 cheers for Omar Khan for getting that done, for getting it done so early in the process, before free agency, before a potential T. Higgins deal, which would be, reset the market, and a potential Jamar Chase deal that's certainly going to actually reset the market, because this Metcalf deal comes in behind Jefferson, comes in behind CeeDee Lamb. So it's top of the market, but it's not tippy top. And that's great business because it's going to become a bargain very quickly. The salary cap ballooned even more than expected this offseason. It's going to continue to go up. The cap always goes up. And these deals quickly become bargains, getting it out to a 5th year. I'm sure Metcalf loves the stability of that heading into his 30s, and the Steelers, I just think it's a great deal. And it'll be a great deal for this season to try to win with whatever bridge quarterback is the starter, and a great deal for the future as you try to find that future franchise quarterback. And I would love to hear from anyone in the chat, anyone hanging out with me tonight. What are your thoughts on this deal? Is it a good deal? Is it a steal? Is it a fleecing? Everyone loves to say fleecing. Are you excited about the direction of the Steelers? Should they be rebuilding? Should they be loading up even further? Where does this, as I'm going to transition to the George Pickens of it all, a question that I want to talk about, and if you're in the chat, your thoughts are always welcome. Where does this put the Steelers' priorities in the first round of the draft? Are they going to spend it on the defensive side of the ball now, which was maybe a possibility before this? Is it interior offensive line? Is it Jackson Dart at quarterback? The Steelers, this frees the Steelers up, though, in my opinion, before I get to George Pickens. I think it frees the Steelers up heading into free agency, heading into the draft, to not have to overspend at receiver. And I don't think this is an overspend, adding Metcalf. And now George Pickens. As I attempt to, we are live here, as I attempt to pull up the George Pickens contract and where he's at in that thing heading into the final year of it, which is a tenuous situation that may lead to George Pickens being disgruntled. I can't imagine a world in which the Steelers, a team that is, relatively frugal at the wide receiver position, unless it's an Antonio Brown or, a truly big name guy, because they believe in their ability to draft and develop these guys. And maybe that changes without Kevin Colbert, but I would be very surprised if heading into the final year of his rookie contract, the Steelers trade a 2nd-round pick for DK Metcalf, give him 5 years, $150 million, and then pay George Pickens as well. I don't see a world in which that happens. So is George Pickens willing to head into a lame duck potentially season, which we don't really talk about a lame duck wide receiver, more quarterback or a coach, but heading into the final year of his contract? Is he going to be comfortable doing that? Is he going to show up on day one of training camp? Is he going to behave himself if things aren't going well and DK is getting more targets? I think this not only opens up the Steelers to not have to pay George Pickens, because that's not a situation you want to be in. George Pickens lollygagged through the Cowboys game and self-destructed against the Bengals in the regular season. and was, by the end of the year, a net negative on the field, even though he was by far the most talented and best wide receiver for the Steelers. He was a nightmare by the end of the season. Now the Steelers aren't boxed into a corner where they got to pay the guy. And that is a great situation to be in, where you can say, all right, we'll go 1 year with Pickens and Metcalf. We'll see what this offense looks like. We'll chuck a bunch of go balls, whoever's a quarterback. And maybe it's awesome. And maybe Pickens and Metcalf get along and Pickens is a good soldier. And okay, you get your contract too, or we franchise tag you heading into next offseason. Or if you're Omar Khan and George Pickens says DK got his money and starts to be the squeaky wheel, he can say, all right, we'll go find yourself a deal somewhere else and we'll ship you out of town because we got a more talented replacement that's a more trustworthy player. It gives the Steelers so much leverage in the Pickens negotiation. It gives the Steelers a fulcrum around which to build their offense. It frees them of being so to have to acquiesce to every George Pickens whim. When he's frustrated, you have to deal with it. When he's throwing a tantrum on the sidelines, you have to deal with it because you can't bench him because you have Van Jefferson as your next target. And Calvin Austin, who's a good player, who I love Calvin Austin running out of the slot between Metcalf and Pickens. That is just bombs away all the time. You don't have to box yourself in to the George Pickens experience. You don't have to lower the seatbelt and the restraint on the George Pickens roller coaster. You don't have to do that anymore because you gave up a second round pick for DK Metcalf. It's a fantastic deal. And one that really refocuses the offseason, even without a quarterback on the roster. It gives clarity to everything the Steelers do in a really meaningful way. And this is all under the understanding that I still think this is the wrong direction for the organization to go in. I'm because to swim against the tide constantly and every time the Steelers make a move, say they just need to rebuild, is not going to be interesting or realistic. But it's worth me bringing up. I think the Steelers should rebuild. I think the Steelers should be adding draft capital, not spending it. I'm glad if they are spending it, they're spending it on a relatively younger receiver. And they're spending it on the offensive side of the ball. And it's only a second round pick. But I think they should be trading George Pickens and potentially trading some of their defensive stars to get younger and try to make the timeline work that you can build to a championship roster. I still don't see this move being one where the Steelers are now a championship contender. Obviously not. They don't have a quarterback. But if the goal of this organization is to win as many games as possible, and that's clear, and if the goal is to maybe develop Justin Fields for a year while drafting a young guy, this makes that much better. And a lot of people in the NFL really believe in build it first, then get the quarterback. And it's hard to disagree with that theory. It's hard to disagree with that because we've seen guys like Jared Goff in great situations thrive after not thriving in a worse situation, right? We've seen these things be so circumstantial. I think the truly great players like Jaden Daniels elevate a team above its circumstance, right? And they just thrive despite. But it's rare to luck into a guy like that. So, okay, build it on the offensive side of the ball. I still want to see the Steelers get younger on defense, and that's something that will be a priority in free agency. But I think this is a really good move and a really important move for the offensive side of the ball for the Steelers. And as Michael P., who's been super on it in the chat, love it, Michael. This might make Pickens movable now. Absolutely. I think absolutely this is what the Steelers are trying to do. They're trying to give themselves an out with Pickens where they can move him and not be completely screwed, or they can keep him and your quarterback situation, your situation for your quarterback is much better, and your quarterback situation is less tenuous and less determinative of your outcome as a team. Right? The better the rest of your roster is, the less important the quarterback becomes. And it's always going to be the most important position, but by how many magnitudes? DK Metcalf helps lower that quite a bit, that the threshold of being a winnable team. And I think if you build, I will say this to my Justin Fields would be in the best situation he's ever had as an NFL quarterback comment. If you tell me the Steelers go into 2025 with George Pickens heading into the final year of his contract and they get him on the field somehow and he doesn't whine about a contract extension, and DK Metcalf, who's happy and paid, Calvin Austin in the slot, Pat Freiermuth, and a young offensive line with everybody healthy, and you have Justin Fields and maybe a running back you draft in the 3rd round, and you do a quarterback run heavy scheme where you're forcing the defense to defend 11 in the run all the time with options and with QB power and QB counter and all these different things. And then you throw deep balls to DK and Pickens. I almost guarantee you're going to get above average NFL offensive efficiency by whatever metric you want to pick, EPA per play, DVOA. The Steelers would be in the top half. I almost guarantee that because you're just building something that is statistically efficient. You're building something like maybe the Philadelphia Eagles have a little bit around Jalen Hurts, and Jalen Hurts is far superior to Justin Fields. I'm not saying anything of the sort, but you simplify things for an athletic quarterback. You let him get downhill. You let him pound the rock. You let your running back that you drafted, and maybe Jalen Warren, if you want to bring him back, pound the rock, and you launch deep balls to DK and Pickens. Sign me up for that. I'm so into that idea. And I'll even say this. If the Steelers want to do that type of offense with Justin Fields, who I think the ceiling could be the highest, or even if it's Aaron Rodgers, whoever. If you're telling me that Ashton Genty is there when the Steelers come on the board in the 1st round, and they take another running back after what we just experienced with the 4 years of Najee Harris, I will be honestly over the moon. Because I think Ashton Genty is a phenomenal player, so much better than Najee Harris ever was as a prospect or even as a pro. Right now, Genty is better than that. His contact balance is absurd. He has home run hitting ability. His yards after contact, it was just, he had over 1,000 yards after contact last year. And yes, it's in the Mountain West, but I don't care at all. Genty is a star. And even if they wanted to take a Marion Hampton out of North Carolina in the 1st round, maybe I would want them to trade back a few picks. But if that is the deal and you get big and physical and fast on offense with Fields or Rodgers at quarterback, in this idea of making the defense defend the 11-man run game, I'm into the Fields idea a lot with a talented running back, 2 talented receivers, a really young and physical and athletic offensive line. You will have a better than average offense. You just will. Because you're just raising the floor of talent on that thing. And Arthur Smith is not a superstar. but he is damn competent. He is damn competent enough to not mess that up. And the only thing that could is maybe Mike Tomlin's fear and the fact that he's always living in them with the offense and the fear of turning the ball over. If you open that thing up and let the quarterback chuck some deep balls to those guys, they're going to win them well more than 50% of the time on those 50-50 balls. So I think there's a world in which the Steelers are a hell of a lot closer to winning a playoff game next year. And they were not close this year, even for how long they led the AFC North and for how long it looked like they were going to be close to winning a playoff game throughout the season. They were not close. Their defense was completely overmatched by Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry, and they got blown off the field. Now I think if you have Pickens and you have DK, you at least have a chance to match it if your defense is getting blown off the field. And if not, all right, maybe you're winning a first-round playoff game. And at this point, I would rejoice for a playoff win. The Steelers are clearly showing us they're heading in a direction. I've been begging for direction, and okay, I'm going to be in on it. I've been begging for either all in or all out. The Steelers have clearly shown us they're going in. They're trading the second-round pick for DK Metcalf. Okay, I'll go in with them. And I think as the roster is currently constructed, if you add some competency at quarterback, you could be in a situation where you're winning your first playoff game in a very long time. In way too long of a time. And you're setting up a much better situation for the future, for the next quarterback. Whether that's a mid-round pick this year or a first-round pick next year or the year after. So I'm thrilled about this trade. I don't think it makes the Steelers a Super Bowl contender, and I don't think the Steelers are operating in a way that will get them much closer to a Lombardi other than, the chance of winning a playoff game. But if you can build an offense with a really good offensive line and talented receivers in place, you're going to have a much easier time getting the franchise quarterback, and then you might be off to the races. So this is if I had to grade this move, right? We want to do grades. And if you're in the chat, grade this move. Is this an A+? Is this an A-? Give it to me. I know Michael P, you've been hanging out in the chat. I think considering what you give up here, giving up a second-round pick and moving around some late picks, signing this big contract, you finally get this foundational piece. I'm going to go A. I won't go A+ because I think there is still a flaw in the ultimate, what are we doing? We should be trying to get younger of it all. Organizational philosophy. But Michael P says A. I'm with you. I think it's a very good deal. I think this is a very good trade for the Steelers, and it sets them up in numerous ways. And now to the draft of it all. Because I mentioned this a little bit when I was, what could this offense look like? What are the priorities in the first round of the draft? Because just about every mock draft that I'm looking at is saying maybe a Emeka Egbuka in the first round or another wide receiver, Matthew Golden, to get a field stretcher. The Steelers are not going to draft a first-round wide receiver after just spending their second-round pick on DK Metcalf and paying him this kind of money. So what's the need? What say you? I think running back is a massive need. I don't have an aversion necessarily to taking a running back in the first round. I have an aversion to taking a not hyper elite running back in the first round. I'll take Ashton Genty. I'll take Amarion Hampton. I will not take Najee Harris. And Michael P mentions liking Cam Scatterbo. I like him in late round as well. I don't think he has the speed to run the system that Arthur Smith wants to run. But I do like him as a player. In the first round, all right, running back is a need. Offensive line feels like a need, but not when everything's healthy. And free agency will give us some indication into this, but Zach Frazier's locked in at center for hopefully the next 10 years. Sayamalu's aging at left guard, but you feel fairly good about that. You think Broderick Jones goes to left tackle. Fautanu goes in at right tackle. You've already invested back-to-back first-round picks in the offensive line. I can't see it being an offensive line. Can't see it being wide receiver. Can't see it being offensive lineman. You paid Pat Freiermuth. So unless for some reason Tyler Warren falls, which I'd be into that. R Barley 18 says Hampton a better pro than Genty. Possibly. Definitely. I'm not going to put any ceiling on what Amarion Hampton can be. I haven't fully dug in. I mean, I've done my cursory look at all the running backs in this class. I haven't done a deep dive on the guys, so I will plead a tiny bit of ignorance on that analysis. But Amarion Hampton's an absolute stud. Absolute stud. And I would not be surprised if Ashton Genty is not the best running back in this class. And that has nothing to do with how good I think Ashton Genty is going to be. I think it has everything to do with how incredible this running back class is. So to me, on the offensive side of the ball, quarterback is obviously. But I don't think there's going to be anyone worth taking there because I'm not a Jackson Dart guy. And you can go, if you want more quarterback content, go to last week's episode. Myself and Cody Williams break them all down for you. Running back is the only draft need I see on offense in the first round. I think you always want to add offensive line depth, and you can always add a receiver late, and you can definitely take a mid-round quarterback this year. But in the first round, if you're drafting on the offensive side of the ball, running back's kind of where you look. I mean, you always draft best player available, but no one actually does that. Everyone just drafts to fill a need. And that's what the Steelers will do too. Defensively now, this opens up the Steelers to spend their first-round draft pick on the defensive side of the ball. Unless, as Michael P says in the chat, and I'm loving the interaction from the chat, so send your first-round suggestions, your draft needs, everything. Michael P says in the chat, any chance they go for broke and move up to the top 5 to get a QB? I don't think so. I disagree with R Barley 18 here saying there is no QB worth a first-round pick this year, let alone top 5. I think Cam Ward is absolutely worth a top 5 pick. I think Cam Ward is going to be a very good NFL quarterback and maybe the 7 to 12 range at his top tier outcome. But I don't think there's any reason the Steelers should go for broke and trade up for a quarterback because I just don't think they have access to that level without shelling out tons of first-round picks. Because there's no Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward will both be off the board by pick 5, pick 7 at the latest. And I don't see any world in which the Steelers could jump up there, especially with the draft capital they just gave up off the board. So I don't think they're going to go for broke. I also don't think there's a quarterback, to R Barley 18's point, I don't think there's a quarterback beyond Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, and I'm not particularly high on Shedeur Sanders, though I still think he's a first-rounder, worth a first-round pick outside of that group. So I don't think the Steelers are going to be drafting a quarterback, and if they draft Jackson Dart, I will be unhappy on draft day. On the defensive side of the ball, this opens everything up There are good corners at the back end of the first round. Jahdae Barron, Benjamin Morrison coming off an injury from Notre Dame. Maxwell Hairston tested incredibly well out of Kentucky. There are tons of cornerbacks and even defensive backs. Nicky Manwari was an NFL Combine superstar, and I would love that level of athleticism on the back end. You could draft I don't love first round safeties that much, but you could, and you could definitely draft a corner to pair with Joey Porter Jr., who didn't have the best year, didn't really take that leap to being the cornerback one that everyone wanted him to become, and still kind of sees in his future. I don't know that that's ever going to happen. I think he'll probably be like a very good 2, and that's fine if you have another very good 2 on the other side. And I think cornerback is definitely in play. The Steelers have not drafted corners well under the Mike Tomlin era, better yet. But I think there are good corners that will be available when the Steelers are drafting. Where I think the Steelers probably should go, and where I think the strength of this draft lies, is along the defensive line. There are so many good interior defensive linemen and edges. And the Steelers are way over leveraged on the edge with TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith. And that makes me think interior defensive line is where I would be doing a ton of work if I'm the Steelers. And I'll go pull up some of the names and talk about the guys that I really like, because it's a loaded class on the interior defensive line. And I think a lot of them will be available to the Steelers when they're drafting in the first round, now no longer needing a wide receiver. And when you don't have a desperate need, right? They need defensive tackle. They have Keanu Benton. They have an aging Cam Hayward who was an All-Pro last year. Like, they are not desperate need of it. It frees you up to take the best player. And I think the best player available will likely be along the defensive line. So looking at the board, Mason Graham's going to be gone. Every other player that I'm going to read off here who I think will be a very good pro could be available when the Steelers are picking. Walter Nolan out of Ole Miss. I think he's so disruptive and not yet even tapped into all of his potential. Kenneth Grant is the one that I really want, who is just an athletic freak. Was, I think, number 1 on Bruce Feldman's freaks list. If not number 1, then very near the top, because he is just absurd. I don't think he did very much testing at the Combine. No one really did a ton of testing at the Combine. But Kenneth Grant is an athletic freak, played next to Mason Graham, so I think he's overshadowed a little bit. But he is, right now, my dream draft day, you walk away with either a Genty or a Hampton for the offensive side, or a Kenneth Grant. And I'm always draft defensive linemen, always draft the trenches. And if the Steelers did that, I'd be absolutely thrilled. Derek Harmon out of Oregon, as I continue this list finally. Derek Harmon out of Oregon. He's another one, first round talent that will be available when the Steelers are picking, likely be available when the Steelers are picking. I think he's very good too. I think there are people that don't love his tape as much, but very disruptive along the defensive line for Oregon. TJ Sanders from South Carolina, Tyleik Williams of Ohio State, Omar Norman Lott is an undersized guy from Tennessee who is just absurdly productive. Alfred Collins of Texas is somebody that I really love. I thought he was so good along the Texas defensive line for their college football playoff run, and is an underrated player. Even a guy like Joshua Farmer out of Florida State or Darius Alexander out of Toledo, right? Like, that's not reading off my list. That's reading off other lists. The guys that jump out to me, though, Grant, and I really like me some Alfred Collins, but I think it'd be a little rich where the Steelers are drafting in the first round. But now they can do that. They can draft a really talented player at a position that is already a strength. And how amazing is that? How great is that the Steelers have freed themselves up from needing a wide receiver, because that is was a problem all last offseason. And everyone was begging Omar to trade for Brandon Ayuk and pay Brandon Ayuk. And a year later, because he was patient, and now the wide receiver market is just so saturated with guys. Last year, it was not. Last year, it was Brandon Ayuk or bust. This year, it is just remarkably saturated with talented players. Devontae Adams signed a contract today with the Rams. Deebo Samuel is on the move. Cooper Kupp's going to be on the move. Tons of guys out there. Omar Khan was able to get DK Metcalf, who I think is a better player than Ayuk, if not better, comparable player. He's been more productive, and Ayuk now coming off an injury, he was able to get him for a second rounder when Ayuk would have absolutely cost a first. And I think that is just excellent work. And finally, is the Steelers leveraging their organizational stability to their advantage. Too often, the Steelers operate like a desperate front office and a desperate franchise. This happens constantly. Mike Tomlin is desperate to win every single game, every single year. He overdraft players because of need. Terrell Edmonds, Artie Burns, right? This happens all the time. The Steelers don't have to do that because Mike Tomlin's not going to get fired if he has a losing season. That's probably not going to happen. He's probably not going to have a losing season because he's Mike Tomlin. But he's not going to get fired if he does. And neither is Omar Khan. So use that organizational stability to your advantage. Take a year out of the wide receiver market when you think you're going to have to overpay for Brandon Ayuk and say, nope, we're gonna ride with Van Jefferson for a year because we can, because it won't get us fired. And now we can land DK Metcalf. Just really good work. Really, really good work. And I continue to be very impressed by Omar Khan running the Steelers and the job he's done. He's taken dart throws at quarterback, and eventually you're going to have to take a home run swing. I understand that. But again, the stability that he has, the job security that he has, means he doesn't have to take that home run swing right now. He doesn't have to take it on a pitch he doesn't love. He can wait for his pitch. And I think the Steelers are doing that under Omar Khan, and that is going to be how you get out of NFL purgatory. I think one way we saw the Steelers start to do that a little bit was stacking talent at a surplus position like the defensive line. And I think for a little bit last year, their defensive line was fairly dominant and withstood a lot of injuries. And I think the offensive line withstood far more injuries than any other offensive line could. Maybe not any other, but most others, because they had a ton of depth there. So I think stacking strengths in the trenches is huge. And then waiting for your opportunities to pick your spots with these big swings. And this was a great one. I love the start to the offseason. I love this start to the offseason. It makes free agency more interesting and more fun. It makes heading into the draft way more interesting and more fun, even with one less high tier pick, right? High value pick in the second round. But this opens up a lot of things for the Steelers in the offseason and into next season. Next up probably has to be the quarterback position. I gave you my list. I'll give it again. If you want to give yours in the chat, share your list of quarterbacks. Who do you want? Just give me who you want. I know all the baggage that comes with this, all the combustibility that comes with this. I want Aaron Rodgers first. I just want to see it. If it's a disaster, that's fine. The Steelers can withstand an organizational disaster much better than the Jets are because they're not dysfunctional. So I don't think it would tank everything bringing in Aaron Rodgers, even if it doesn't work. And I think there's still some talent there. So I'm interested in that swing. After him, Justin Fields. Just give him the chance to grow throughout a season. Give him the chance to chuck the deep balls. Maybe he'll get some nice deep ball variants like Russell Wilson did, and with another talented deep ball receiver. All right, I'm into that. And then last on that list, on this 3-person list, because I don't include Darnold, I just don't think that's realistic, would be Russell Wilson. So that's what's next for the Steelers. The draft will be coming up. Free agency is going to be huge. A lot of needs in free agency. Tommy and Shane did a great job breaking that down with their free agency primer on Wednesday. If you're checking in for the first time today or tonight because of this big news, and you're joining me for this emergency pod, go check out that episode. We have tons of great content on the page. Subscribe to the page, like this episode. And check out all of Tommy Jagai's content on stillcurtain.com, because if you don't have enough of this DK Metcalf breakdown from me, if you didn't get enough from me, you can get more and more from him over on the website. So go check that out. Thank you for hanging out with me tonight. We're nearly got an hour out of this DK Metcalf news. I think that's all I got for you on a Sunday night. I'm going to be saying goodnight, but they're going to be back on Wednesday to break this down even further. And it's just going to be a big, exciting week heading into free agency for the Steelers. Such a fun start to it. An A-graded trade for me. 2nd round pick for DK Metcalf. A lot of fun. A lot of good stuff. Thanks for hanging out tonight. I'll talk to you next Monday. It's Sunday now, but next Monday, I'll talk to you. And until then, as always, go Steelers.